Greetings, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Jennifer McClellan, and I have the privilege of representing Virginia's 4th Congressional District in the United States House of Representatives. I am the first Black woman elected to Congress from the Commonwealth of Virginia. I am the daughter, granddaughter, and great-granddaughter of educators, domestic workers, community leaders, and civil rights activists who struggled for equality in the Jim Crow South. My great-grandfather was born shortly after the Civil War on a plantation where his parents had been enslaved. Shortly after Reconstruction, he had to pass a literacy test and find 3 white men to vouch for him just to be able to register to vote. But my great-grandmother couldn't vote. My grandfather and father had to pay poll taxes to cast their ballots. My mother comes from generations of domestic workers who were often overlooked and underpaid despite the vital role they played in our society. And while my father voted at the age of 22, my mother couldn't vote until well into her 30s after the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. My family faced tremendous obstacles to exercise their fundamental right to vote, yet they never wavered in their commitment to our political process or their desire to create a better future for the next generation. Throughout my nearly 2 decades in elected office, I have carried these stories with me, stories that motivate me to do my part to build a more inclusive, tolerant, and just future for my own children. When I entered the House of Delegates in Virginia in 2006, I was one of just 20 women in that chamber, out of 100. I felt that imbalance when I became the first delegate to become pregnant and give birth while in office. I was asked by a male colleague, "Are you going to retire?" Yet another male colleague who became a father 2 months after I gave birth was not asked that question. It has been a long march for gender equality under the law, a march propelled by abolitionists, the civil rights movement, the suffrage movement, and the women's rights movement, which from the very beginning included women of color on the front lines, even when we were at last to benefit from that work. Black women, including the founders of my sorority, Delta Sigma Theta Incorporated, in their first public act, marched for the right to vote in 1913, even when told to march in the back. Black women marched for civil rights in 1963 from the U.S. Capitol to the Lincoln Memorial, even when not given a speaking role. Throughout the course of history, Black women have been integral to the fight for equality. We laid the groundwork for progress while overcoming tremendous obstacles. We did our part. And I am fighting to continue doing mine. While in the Virginia General Assembly, I was part of a multi-generational group of Black women lawmakers who came together to make Virginia the 38th and final state needed to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. And it was poetic justice that our Commonwealth, the birthplace of American democracy and the birthplace of American slavery, was the state to bring the ERA across the finish line. It was a feat that the first women to arrive in Jamestown 400 years earlier could never imagine. In 1619, the men of Jamestown realized that they needed women to make Virginia a permanent settlement. So they actively recruited women to, quote, make wives of their inhabitants. And in 1620, the first 90 women arrived on the shores of Virginia, and their rights were surrendered to their husbands. They could not vote. They could not own property. Black women were considered property and had even fewer rights. 156 years later, Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men were created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson most certainly did not include me in that declaration. 72 years later, Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote women in the sequel at the first Seneca Falls Convention. In the Declaration of Sentiments, she wrote that all men and women were created equal. In 1787, the Constitution created a government by, of, and for we the people, but we did not include everybody. It took 81 years to begin extending that promise beyond white men. In 1868, the 14th Amendment promised equal protections under the law, but women still did not experience that reality. In fact, the 14th Amendment added the first mention of gender into the Constitution declaring all male citizens over 21 should be able to vote. It took another 52 years for the 19th Amendment to grant women that right. And 3 years later, the Equal Rights Amendment was introduced. And we are still fighting to publish it in the Constitution. The states have done their part, and I was proud of my role in that fight. Now in Congress, I am still fighting to enshrine gender equality under the law into the Constitution. As a vice chair of the first ever Congressional ERA caucus, as the first Black woman to represent Virginia in Congress, and as a mother to 2 young children, I will continue fighting to do my part so the next generation is not left fighting the same battles that our mothers, our grandmothers, and our great-grandmothers fought. As we witness widespread, systematic attacks on reproductive freedom, access to the ballot box, and other personal freedoms, it is imperative that we take immediate action to make gender equality the law of the land. This Congress, I signed a discharge petition to demand an immediate vote on ERA caucus co-chair Ayanna Pressley's resolution to remove the arbitrary ratification deadline for the ERA and enshrine it into law. I will continue my efforts until the ERA is published as the 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution, because we owe it to our daughters and our granddaughters, as well as our mothers, our grandmothers, and great-grandmothers. I thank Columbia Law School and Georgetown University Law Center for your work on the Equal Rights Amendment project and for creating space for today's discussion. Together, we will continue doing our part in the march for gender equality under the law.